Hello Year 10, welcome to another lesson on the early Earth. If you were part of last week's lessons, we were looking at the Hadean Eon, so the early Earth forming. And if you look at this little timeline here, we've already looked at Earth coalescing, water, moon, the formation of the moon, core accretion, so how the layers of the Earth formed, and we very briefly talked about the magnetic field. I will be discussing this, finishing this part off at the beginning of this lesson. And we're going to talk about the late bombardment stage. The late bombardment stage is the final stage in the Hadean Eon, and we may have time to discuss the next eon in the formation of Earth. As ever, if you could do your do now questions for me, that would be fantastic. If you want to pause the video here, write down these questions and I will go over the answer. But I'll read the questions out to you. Question number 1. What does the word coalescing mean? What does the word coalescing mean? Question 2. What percentage of water on Earth is fresh water? What percentage of water on Earth is fresh water? Number 3. What was the name of the protoplanet that smashed into the early Earth to help form the moon? What was the name of the protoplanet that smashed into the early Earth to help form the moon? Question 4. What happened to the heaviest elements on Earth during the Hadean Eon? What happened to the heaviest elements on Earth during the Hadean Eon? And the last one, how do some scientists believe water got on Earth? How do some scientists believe water got on Earth? So if you want to pause it here, please have an attempt and I'll just go over the answers. Okay, coalescing. So we talked about that a lot in the last lesson. So what does the word coalescing mean? To coalesce is to come together to form one mass or whole. So when we were talking about the formation of planets, we're talking about all the space debris smashing together to form protoplanets, early planets, and we use the word coalescing as a way to describe when all that material forms one big piece of material. I use some other examples like rivers, so small rivers coalescing to form one big river, eventually into an estuary and then into the sea. So coalescing is a word that we need to use when we're talking about the formation of planets. Question 2. What percentage of water on Earth is fresh water? And remember, fresh water is the only type of water that we can use as animals. And it's a very small percentage, only 0.65%. So sometimes you'll see that as written as less than 1% is fresh water. So if you think about all the oceans we have in the world, they're obviously salt water. We can't use them for drinking or growing crops unless you use a desalination plant. And countries like Australia do have desalination plants, but they're very energy inefficient, I guess, or they cost a lot of energy to run them, so they don't run them a lot. But it would make sense to have those things working, given how much oceans and seawater we have and the lack of fresh water. Question 3. What was the name of the protoplanet that smashed into the early Earth to help form the moon? That was Theia. So Theia was another protoplanet that was forming in the same orbit as the proto-Earth. They smashed into one another, and a big chunk of the Earth was basically broken up, and this started to form or coalesce around the Earth, and that became our moon. Question 4. What happened to the heaviest elements on Earth during the Hadean Eon? They sank to the middle and formed our metallic core. So remember, we talked about iron and nickel. We know iron is a heavy element, one of the heavy elements that forms in stars and often indicates the end of a star's life if it builds up this heavy element, 26 protons. And they sank to the middle and the lighter elements rose to the top. So essentially, the early Earth melted. And had it not melted, we wouldn't have this molten core, this metallic core, and therefore we wouldn't have our magnetic field, which I'll discuss. So we didn't have the magnetic field, we wouldn't be here, because the radiation from the sun would have been too strong for any sort of life to get going. And the final question, number 5. How do some scientists believe water got on Earth? Well, some scientists believe it came from comets. Comets are pieces of space rock, essentially, that have ice on them sometimes. And the Earth was getting bombarded with a lot of these. And some scientists believe this is how water got onto planet Earth. So there's another theory that I think I'll discuss later on as well. But this is one way that we think water potentially got onto Earth. Cool. So just a little bit of a recap on that because it's important. So the sun couldn't pull in the heavy elements. They spiraled and gelled together into planets of their own and started forming rocky planets. And the Earth coalesced surrounding matter to form a sphere. The heaviest material like iron and zinc sank to the core, and finally lighter material remained on top to form a crust. So if you look at the Earth here, this image, if you see the core, the mantle, and I'll break these down in a little minute, but if you look at the crust, okay, that's where we live, this tiny, thin shell. The majority of our planet is this basically liquid metal, and we just live in this tiny, thin shell called the crust. So that's what the majority of our planet actually looks like, but we just don't see it, obviously. We sometimes see it when a volcano explodes and you have the molten lava, and it's the stuff coming up from the mantle coming up out through the crust. And this is really important for land formation. So all of the continents that you can see on planet Earth just now were created because of the layering on the Earth, and the formation of continents is something that was really important in the next eon that I'll discuss later. So I showed you this image, really cool images trying to illustrate the magnetic field. So we can't see it all the time. We can see it at certain points, which I'll explain again. But this magnetic field surrounds the Earth. You can see it is strongest here at the poles, in the North Pole here and in the South Pole. And this magnetic field is really important for protecting us from solar flares. And like I said, it's strongest in the poles. And you can see the Northern Lights is basically this magnetic field that we can see, which is invisible. It's there all the time, but we can see it at certain times of the year. Particularly when a solar flare hits off the magnetic field, it produces these fantastic colorations. So that's one way you can see it, and that is protecting us on Earth. So here's a really nice diagram, and what I'd like you to do is pause the video here and draw this diagram in your book, and I'll explain it first. So we have the sun, which is massive, and these things called solar flares are basically like big explosions on the surface of the sun, and they happen periodically, and it's always giving off this radiation. So you can see here the yellow lines represent the sun's radiation, either in the form of a solar wind or solar flares, and the purple lines here represent our magnetic field, and the auroral oval, these little green areas here, are the kind of strongest parts of the magnetic field. So you can see this magnetic shield doesn't just protect the Earth. Okay, it's got a massive perimeter around the Earth. It's particularly strong around the Earth, but it goes way into space as well. And that protects us. If those purple lines weren't there, these solar flares would destroy any life that was going on here in the early days of evolution. And today, for example, if our magnetic field just stopped, it wouldn't be good for us at all. So what I'd like you to do, you don't need to be as detailed, but if you could draw a diagram here, that'd be fantastic. So I'd pause the video and draw this little diagram showing our magnetic field protecting Earth from harmful solar wind and solar flare. Okay, so this is a little bit more of a detailed diagram showing the anatomy of the Earth. So you may have heard of anatomy before. Usually it's reserved when we're talking about humans. So we're studying human anatomy. You're usually looking at the inside of a human, looking at the bones, perhaps where the organs are. But anatomy can be applied to anything. You could type in anatomy of a car and it'll give you a really nice breakdown of what's inside the car and usually labels that, which is useful for us. So this is the anatomy of the Earth, what's going on inside of the Earth. So you can see here in the middle, we have the inner core, which is this ball here. Then we have the core, which surrounds the inner core. Then we have the mantle, which is this massive kind of orange part here. This is where all the lava comes from. And the tiny thin crust that I discussed there. So what I'd like you to do, we're doing a few diagrams in this lesson. What I'd really like you to do is if you could just label the diagram 1, 2, 3, and 4. Okay, so write down 1, 2, 3, 4 and label them for me. And if you could take a photograph and put it on the Google Classroom, I'll see if everyone's got the anatomy of Earth correct. So all I need you to do, you don't need to draw a list. You can if you want. I've said you can. But if you just want to do 1, 2, 3, 4 and tell me what is number 1, what is number 2, what is number 3, and what is number 4. And you can jump back in the video if you need help for that as well. If you want to draw the whole diagram, that's superb. But all I really require you to do is label it. So if you could just do 1, 2, 3, 4 and tell me what we got. Okay, so we're at the last stage of the Hadean Eon, the late bombardment stage. So the late bombardment stage was a really violent stage in the Earth's history, and it was characterized by all of these meteorites, comets, asteroids smashing off the Earth. And we know that these impacts generated a lot of heat. Obviously, it would be a very violent place. You wouldn't want to be there as a human. And this late bombardment stage is kind of the last violent stage in this eon and marks the end of the Hadean Eon itself. So, let's just summarise what we've learned from this eon. The story of Earth starts in the Hadean Eon. If you could rewind time 4.6 billion years, Earth was almost unrecognisable. Asteroids and comets repeatedly pelted Earth, and the temperature was hot with lava flowing. It didn't look like the blue marble we're all familiar with, so it didn't look like the Earth we know today. From 4.6 to 4 billion years ago, the Hadean Eon is the first eon of Earth. The key events are heat source. So the Earth established a heat source with the sun. So the sun was generating enough heat for Earth to get really warm at that stage. Really importantly though, there was a magnetic field created when the Earth melted. And in the centre of the Earth we have all these metallic elements like iron and nickel. And the convection currents produced a geodynamo. So don't worry too much about that. We're going to discuss that in the next lesson. And this was the first step for life to persist on Earth. So without that magnetic field, like I say, Earth would not have life on it. It would have been very difficult, if not impossible, for life to evolve. So this magnetic field, although we don't really think about it, is something that is the first step for life to persist on Earth. And really importantly, we had moon formation. So the formation of our moon was key to stabilizing our climate. And again, we're going to discuss that in a later lesson. But the moon formation was a critical step during the Hadean Eon for future development on Earth. What I'd like you to do is if you could write down these 3 lines here, these 3 sentences in bold. Heat source. Earth established a heat source with the sun. Magnetic field and moon formation. They're the key takeaway stages of the Hadean Eon. So if you know these 3 things happen during this stage, that's fantastic. Okay. I just highlighted in red. So if you want to pause that and write that down, go ahead now. Okay. The last thing I'd like you to do for the Hadean is draw this timeline. I'd like you to draw the timeline with the Earth coalescing, water, moon, core accretion, magnetic field, and the late bombardment stage. And if you want to add more information to your own timeline, that'd be fantastic. If you do that, that'll allow me to see, okay, you understand where the key stages are. And again, if you could take a photograph of that for me and put it on the Google Classroom, I'll review them this week. Okay, it's a nice little summary of the Hadean. What we're going to look at in the next lesson is the Archean era. So this was 4 to 2.5 billion years ago. And you can see it gets quite interesting, well, really from the start. I mean, they're all interesting, but the presence of DNA is particularly interesting when we're talking about life. So in the Archean era, we have the first oceans, DNA, tectonic activity, the first continents, prokaryote bacteria, banded iron formation, and the great oxygenation event. So have a look at that, and we're going to look at that in the next lesson. Okay, thank you very much.